everyone, it's Gabriella from Per La Victoire. Today I'll show you step by step how I recreated an original dress from 1847 by modifying a modern sewing pattern. If you've watched my other videos, you may know that I love 1840s fashions. I wanted to try making a variation of the ubiquitous fan front dress, this charming cotton print fan front with a yoke neckline. This dress, dated to 1847, is in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It has a long, full skirt that's cartridge pleated to a straight waistband, short sleeves with 2 ruffles, and a wide neckline. It fastens in the center back with hooks and eyes, which is typical for the 1830s and 40s. Before I started sewing, I quickly looked through online museum collections, auction sites, and fashion plates to look for common details in this style of dress. 3 observations stood out. 1. This style of yoke dress was more commonly seen in children's and teenagers' dresses. Does that mean that adults didn't wear this style of dress? Not necessarily, it just means that it wasn't as common. The 1847 dress at the Met, for instance, looks to be adult-sized. My second observation was that short-sleeved 1840s dresses with gathered fronts tended to be made from finely woven cotton. Definitely not the quilting broadcloth fabric you'd find at a Joann's today. Look at how small these waist pleats are. You can only achieve that with a finely woven fabric. The way the sleeve ruffles drape also indicates that the fabric was lightweight. I also found that this style of dress tended to have a straight waistline rather than a pointed waistline. I think the straight waistlines on these dresses indicate the trend coming in the 1850s and 1860s for straight waistlines on everyday cotton dresses. For this project, I'm using some cotton fabric that I bought from a Facebook group. This is Wyndham Fabrics Civil War IV by Nancy Gear. The fabric label says it's circa 1860, but I think the design is plausible for the 1840s. It's close enough for me. The only problem with this fabric is that it isn't a continuous length of fabric. There is a piece of fabric that is 3 yards long and another piece that is about 2 yards long. The fabric is 45 inches wide with the stripes running parallel to the selvage. Time for some math. To best display the stripes in the fabric, I'll be cutting the skirt panels from selvage to selvage. I'll use 3 panels, which will give me a skirt circumference of about 134 inches. Which falls within the average skirt circumference for this time period. Each skirt panel will be 42 inches long. This includes seam allowance for the hem and waistline. That leaves me with 12 inches by 45 inches of fabric on one piece and 24 by 45 inches of fabric on another piece. Part of the reason why I chose to make a bodice with short sleeves, a yoke, and a straight waistline is that I knew I could squeeze it out of these small pieces of fabric. Let's start by making the skirt. First, I seamed together my 3 panels of fabric, leaving about 10 inches open on one of the seams. This will become the back seam, and this opening will help me get into the dress. Because I seamed up the selvage edges of the fabric, I don't have to do anything to these seams to prevent the fabric from raveling. Dresses in the mid-19th century often had a strip of fabric sewn to the inside of the skirt, called a facing, to help protect the skirt hem from dirt and wear. I've sewn together pieces of plain white cotton for my skirt hem facing. The facing is about 8 inches tall and as wide as the seamed skirt. I had to piece together the facing to make it long enough, but this was a good way to use up scraps of fabric. I lined up one seam of the facing with one seam of the skirt, right sides together, and pinned the facing to the bottom of the skirt. I left one seam of the facing unsewn so that I could sew it up after knowing just how long the facing had to be. This will be a lapped seam with the folded seam allowance lapping over the rest of the facing and stitched into place. I'm preparing for that step by pressing down a 1/2 inch seam allowance on one of the short ends of the facing. Then I stitched the facing to the bottom of the skirt with a 1/2 inch seam allowance on my sewing machine. I pressed open the seam allowances. Then I flipped the facing up towards the skirt. I made sure to leave a little bit of the skirt fabric exposed on the inside of the skirt. This way the white facing won't show through at the hem edge. There are several ways to attach skirt facings. This is just the way I chose to do it and what made sense to me. I'll include links in the description below to other tutorials on how to attach skirt facings. Now it's time to stitch down the top edge of the facing. I start by pressing in a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I pin down the facing, being careful to keep it straight and flat. With my facing pinned in place, I start sewing it to the skirt, taking care to make my stitches large on the inside of the skirt and small on the outside. This will make it easier to remove the facing for cleaning purposes, and will make the stitching almost invisible from the right side of the fabric. At first, I used whip stitches, but it felt like the whip stitches allowed the facing to bubble and bulge a bit. The top edge of the facing didn't lie flat against the skirt. So then I switched to long running stitches, which were faster to sew and looked much better. I stitched across the unfinished lapped seam of the skirt facing. Now it's time to sew up that lapped seam. I begin by making a few back stitches to secure my thread. Then I start sewing large whip stitches to secure the folded seam allowance to the rest of the facing. The top of the skirt is cartridge pleated. To do this, I first press down 3/4 inch along the top of the skirt. I divided the skirt into quarters and used safety pins to mark the center front and sides. This will help me line up the skirt with the bodice later on. I sew cartridge pleats with regular cotton sewing thread. To make the thread a bit stronger, I draw it through beeswax before sewing. I have different techniques for marking the fabric for cartridge pleats, but for this project I'll draw out guidelines with a heat-soluble pen. I'll sew 2 rows of pleats, the first a 1/4 inch away from the top fold, and the second row a 1/2 inch away from the top fold. Each pleat will be a 1/4 inch deep, and I'm using a clear ruler to guide my needle as I stitch the pleats. Yes, this is a bit tedious, but it was a lot easier for me than marking hundreds of lines a 1/4 inch away from each other. For the second row of stitches, I follow the placement from the first row. It's much faster to sew the second row of stitches for cartridge pleats, especially since it's basically the same motion as a running stitch or basting stitch. You just want to make sure both lines of stitches are perfectly aligned with each other. It's also super satisfying to scrunch up the cartridge pleats. This technique is a great way to shrink down a lot of fabric, and personally I find it easier than figuring out the math for other kinds of pleats. Now it's time to put the bodice together. I'll be using Laughing Moon 114 as the base for the bodice. I think this pattern has the perfect bones for an 1840s dress. I'll be modifying the pieces for View B gathered front, View C flat back, and the View A sleeves. I start by making a mock-up of the View C flat back pieces and the View C darted front piece. This darted bodice will become the lining, with the gathered stripe cotton overlay sitting on top. I put on a long wool skirt so that I can use the skirt's waistband to guide the placement for the waistband on my pattern. My wool skirt is also cartridge pleated, and this helps me visualize the final look of the dress. On my bodice mock-up, I also draw out the shape of the yoke. Because this dress closes in the back, I used a zipper for the mock-up. No need to fuss with hooks and eyes just yet. I transferred my pattern changes to tissue paper and added seam allowances. The gathered front overlay from View B has been shortened and narrowed. I didn't have enough fabric to make the gathered overlay as full as the pattern suggested. I also changed the gathered front overlay to be cut on the fold rather than seamed at the center front. The sleeves were shortened and narrowed slightly too. Here are my final bodice pattern pieces, in addition to the fitted lining. A short sleeve piece, a yoke piece, the gathered front piece, and the side front piece. It took some mental gymnastics to lay out the pattern pieces to fit my fabric. In the end, I had to compromise by cutting the sleeves on the straight of grain rather than on the bias. I also cut out some strips for the waistband and 5 rectangles that I'll sew together into 4 sleeve ruffles. A key feature of mid-19th century dresses is piping between the bodice seams. I had very small scraps of fabric left after cutting out the bodice, so I cut out dozens of teeny tiny bias strips and sewed the bias strips together to make one long bias strip. I couldn't believe that from all those tiny scraps I was able to make a strip of bias that was 114 inches long. It was just barely long enough for all the piping I needed. I did my best to match the fabric print where possible to make the seams in the bias strip less obvious. I pressed and trimmed the seam allowances of my long bias strip, then pressed it in half along its length. I like to use this Sugar and Cream brand cotton yarn in my piping. With the zipper foot attachment on my sewing machine, I lay the yarn in the center of the bias strip and sew as close as I can to the yarn, keeping the yarn snug in the fold of the bias strip. I find that using my nails to push the yarn into the fold of the bias works better than using pins. Next, I prepared the lining. I used a plain white cotton for the lining fabric. After tracing the markings for the darts, I pinned the darts together and stitched them on the sewing machine. Pressing the darts after stitching makes them look so much better. Often, dresses in this time period use darts as a place to put boning. To achieve this, I stitched a 1/4 of an inch away from the dart stitching to create a boning channel. I used 1/4 of an inch wide German plastic boning, filing down the rough edges before sliding the boning into the channel. Next, we'll put together the outer bodice. First, the side fronts are stitched to the center front piece. These seams are pressed down away from the center front, and the seam allowance is trimmed to reduce bulk. The top edge of the bodice overlay piece is gathered with hand stitches, about 1/8 of an inch apart. I just find that hand-sewn gathers lay nicer than machine-sewn gathers. I left about 2 inches ungathered on each side of the bodice, based on the proportion of the gathering on the original dress. The original dress also has piping between the gathered front and the yoke. I laid a strip of piping along the bottom edge of the yoke, with the cord of the piping facing the top of the yoke and the raw edges facing the bottom of the yoke. I basted the piping in place by hand. Good thing I find hand sewing soothing because I'll be doing a lot of it to finish this bodice. I lined up the front panel with the yoke and adjusted the gathers at the top of the front panel to fit the bottom of the yoke. I had previously marked the center front of the gathered panel with a pin, and I matched up the center of this piece with the center of the yoke. Then I sewed the yoke to the gathered panel, with the piping sandwiched in between, on my sewing machine. Now it's time to gather up the bottom of the bodice to create that quintessential 1840s fan front. On the wrong side of the fabric, I marked out a grid for my stitches. The rows are a 1/2 inch apart and the columns are a 1/4 of an inch apart. For each row of stitches, I secure the thread in the side front seam allowance with a few back stitches. Then with a sort of running stitch, I sew between my markings, making sure where the needle comes up through the fabric matches the row below it. I actually found that the gathers being a 1/4 of an inch apart didn't look right. They were a bit too bulky and pronounced, so I redid this entire process and made the gathers 1/8 of an inch apart instead, sewing new lines of gathers halfway between the original markings. Now that we have all the gathers in place for the fan front, we can tighten and adjust the gathers to fit the bodice. Thankfully, the Laughing Moon pattern has really clear instructions for this process. First, we pin the outer bodice to the bodice lining, matching up the edges and keeping the pieces right sides together. Then, here's the brilliant part, we pull on the gathering threads until the gathered panel fits and lines up with the bodice lining. Then the gathering threads are re-threaded onto the needle and backstitched to the side seam allowances to secure the length of the gathers. The bodice and lining are then unpinned and repinned with the wrong sides together. The right side of the lining is actually the side with the darts and the boning channels. In the mid-19th century, the lining was exposed on the inside of dresses to make alterations easier. Another mid-19th century detail is flat lining, where the lining and outer fabric are treated as one piece, again to make altering clothes easier. This bodice will be flat lined, and to achieve that I need to baste the bodice front to the bodice front lining. The back bodice pieces are also lined up with their respective back lining pieces and basted together. I also sewed a line of basting stitches above the piping at the yoke to help keep the outer bodice and lining together. I have no idea if this was done on the original dress, but I did see a few extant dresses that had visible stitches on the lining from the yoke area. I also sewed a line of large back stitches on the side front seam. Now that the bodice pieces are flat lined, they can be pinned together at the side seams and shoulder seams. There are some curves here, so I'm taking care to ease the fabric along the curve. I stitched these seams on my sewing machine. The pattern tells you to press the side seams open, but that leaves you with a weird fold in the arm side. But if you press the side seams towards the front, the fold disappears and the fabric lays better. Again, I looked at original dresses from this time period and saw that many actually had the side seams pressed towards the center front of the bodice, with the boning channel made from the seam allowances. I decided to copy these originals and sewed a row of small back stitches in my side seam allowance 1/4 of an inch away from the seam line to make a boning channel. I didn't trim any of the fabric in the side seam allowance, so that's 4 layers of fabric stacked together. Some of the original examples I looked at had a bit of the outer fabric peeking through from these side seam boning channels, so I assumed that not trimming the seam allowances here was the common technique. The back edges of the bodice are folded to create a facing. I marked a line 2 inches from the center back raw edge and folded and pressed along this line. I folded in about 1/4 of an inch on the raw edge of the outer fabric. And I trimmed about 1/4 of an inch of the white lining fabric to reduce bulk under the facing. With the lining fabric tucked under the fold of the facing, I stitched the facing down with small, neat whip stitches. These stitches are nearly invisible on the outside of the bodice. Some 1840s bodices had a line of visible top stitching here, and some even inserted a bit of boning into the facing. Maybe I'll try that technique on my next 1840s dress. The necklines of mid-19th century dresses were finished off with piping. The piping helps stabilize the curved neckline, keeping it from stretching out of shape. The piping seam allowances are also folded and stitched down to create a facing that encases all the raw edges. I laid my piping all along the neckline edge, aligning the raw edges of the piping and neckline. The piping is sewn down with a large back stitch. I find that when working with this many layers of fabric, I get better results sewing piping on by hand than with my sewing machine. To reduce bulk, the inner seam allowance of the piping is trimmed down. The seam allowance of the neckline is trimmed down as well. The piping is then rolled in towards the lining and pressed down. This is where the piping turns into the facing. The remaining seam allowance of the piping is folded in towards the lining, about 1/4 of an inch, then pinned in place. The ends of the piping are trimmed, then folded under and concealed by the folded seam allowance. This takes a bit of finagling, but I found using my nail to push under the piping cord helped. The folded seam allowance of the piping is sewn to the lining fabric with small whip stitches. I personally find it so satisfying and easy to finish bodice edges with piping. This technique is used to finish off the sharply curved bottom edges of ball gown bodices too. The raw edges of the piping were folded under at the back edge. I sewed a few whip stitches to secure the piping to the bodice for a clean finish. Next, we'll make the waistband and combine the bodice and skirt pieces. The waistband is made of 3 strips of fabric, each strip centered on a stripe for visual interest. I pin and sew the waistband pieces together, matching the print of the fabric. The waistband will have piping along the bottom to strengthen the area where the skirt is attached. The piping is pinned and stitched to one long edge of the waistband, with the raw edges of the piping aligned to the raw edge of the waistband. After stitching the piping to the waistband, I trim the seam allowances. The top edge of the waistband is folded in 1/4 inch and pressed down. The waistband is then pinned to the bodice. At this point, I tried on the bodice just to make sure I had pinned the waistband straight all around. The waistband is sewn to the bodice with whip stitches. Some original dresses had visible top stitching here, but most didn't, so I figured that near invisible whip stitches would be a logical way to recreate the look of the original dress. When I get to the gathering of the fan front, I make sure each whip stitch catches the hill of each gather. I find it helpful to visualize the gathers as hills and valleys. This secures each gather to the waistband without squishing the gathers. It also ensures that the gathers are lying straight and not wonky. I believe this technique is called stroke gathering. The waistband facing is pieced together from white cotton fabric and is about 2.5 inches tall, including seam allowance. This facing will cover up the raw edges of the waistband on the inside of the dress and provide more strength to the waistband. After all, that waistband has to hold up that big skirt. The facing is pinned and sewn to the bottom of the waistband, right sides together so that all the raw edges are enclosed inside. The seam allowance of the waistband facing is trimmed. I also carefully trimmed the excess fabric at the bottom of the bodice. I left about 3/4 inch of the outer fabric and lining hidden inside the waistband in case I need to adjust the waistband placement at some point in the future. The facing is then flipped up towards the bodice and pressed. The top edge of the facing is folded down about 1/2 inch and pressed down. I trimmed the seam allowance at the top of the facing as well. These dull scissors are perfect for trimming seam allowances because I know they won't snag or tear the fabric below. This top edge of the facing is then sewn down to the bodice lining by hand with whip stitches, being careful to not stitch through the outer fabric. Now that the waistband is finished, we can attach the skirt to the bodice. I marked the center front and sides on the bodice with pins, and I'll match these markings with the safety pins on the skirt. I also match up the center back of the bodice with the center back of the skirt, adjusting the gathers to fit. Because I didn't knot my threads earlier, I can easily manipulate and move the gathers. To sew cartridge pleats to the waistband, first draw your needle through the outside edge of a pleat. Then draw your needle through a few threads of the waistband facing. Repeat this sort of whip stitch, sewing 2 stitches to secure each pleat. It's okay if your needle catches on some of the piping too. The inside edge of the pleats will hang free, swinging outwards from the body. This helps give these skirts their delightful bell shape. I find sewing on cartridge pleats to be a pretty fast and meditative process. I highly recommend giving this technique a try. Now, let's make those cute ruffled sleeves. I start by pinning up the side seams of each sleeve. These seams were then sewn on my sewing machine. The sleeve seams will be flat-felled, so I pressed the seam allowances to one side, then trimmed the bottom seam allowance. The top seam allowance is folded in half, wrapping over the trimmed seam allowance. To make a narrow hem on the sleeves, the bottom edges are folded in 1/4 inch and folded in again 1/4 inch. I must have cut my sleeves a bit off because the hem wasn't laying flat near the sleeve seam. To fix this, I unstitched a bit of the seam, then folded up the hem, slightly offsetting the 2 sleeve edges to make the hem lay flat. I then sewed up the sleeve hems with a whip stitch. I also used a whip stitch to fell down the sleeve seam allowance. Just like the neckline and yoke, there will be a strip of piping between the armscye and sleeves. I sewed the piping on with a back stitch. I overlapped the raw ends of the piping slightly towards the back of the bodice, where it will be less noticeable. At this point, I tried on the bodice and found that the shoulder dropped too far in front, probably because of my narrow shoulders. I unstitched the piping there and restitched it higher up on the shoulder. The side seam of the sleeve is lined up with the side seam of the bodice. Then the sleeve cap is eased into the armscye and the sleeve is sewn in by hand. To make the sleeve ruffles, I first seamed together my 5 rectangles into one long rectangle, matching the print of the fabric where possible. I folded this long strip into quarters and cut it into 4 equal pieces. Each of the 4 pieces was then sewn into a tube. The seams on the ruffles were finished with a tiny flat-felled seam, with the fell whip stitched by hand. I sewed 2 rows of gathers along the top of each ruffle, about 1/4 inch and 1/2 inch away from the raw edge. I also finished off the ruffles with a narrow hem. I marked a line 4 inches away from the hem of the sleeve. This is my placement guide for the top ruffle. The gathers of the ruffle are adjusted to fit around the sleeve. Then I sewed the ruffle onto the sleeve, right sides together, sewing a line of back stitches between the 2 rows of gathers. The fullness of the ruffles is about 1.5 times the circumference of the sleeve instead of the usual 2:1 ratio, but this reduced fullness worked perfectly. I marked a line 2 1/4 inches below the first ruffle for the bottom ruffle placement. I actually reattached these bottom ruffles later on, sewing them 2 3/4 inch below the first ruffle instead. To finish off the ruffles, I ironed them down after attaching them to help the ruffles lay flatter. I also sewed a few basting stitches along the top of the ruffles to help keep the ruffle flat against the sleeve. Finally, I sewed hooks and eyes onto the back of the dress. The eyes are sewn along the fold of the back edge, and the hooks are sewn in about 1/2 inch away from the back edge. These fasteners are placed an inch away from each other. And now, after a month and a half, the dress is all finished. I absolutely love how this dress turned out. I finally got to recreate one of my favorite looks from the 1840s. The print of the fabric makes me smile, and I feel like all the effort of gathering and hand sewing really captures the amazing details of early Victorian dresses. I really enjoyed the challenge of working with a limited amount of fabric, and the challenge of discovering how these dresses were made in the 1840s. I'm surprised that I was even able to achieve some accidental pattern matching along the back. One thing I need to adjust is the placement of the bottom 2 hooks and eyes. The hook needs to be sewn closer to the edge of the bodice so that the waistband lays flat there. This was nearly a zero-waste project. These are all the scraps I'm left with, already in thin strips ready to be used in stuffing a pad or something. And this is the very last bit of piping left over, proof that I barely had enough scraps to even make piping. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope this detailed tutorial has been helpful to you. Please feel free to leave any questions about Victorian dressmaking in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe to my channel for more Victorian sewing content.